Okay, again, a very warm welcome to our 6th public lecture of the focal topic, ISS focal topic here, Justice and Sustainability. I'm very happy to have Franziska Müller and Johanna Tunn today here, who will speak about hydrogen justice. And also I'm happy to have Rainer Kitze, our colleague and research area speaker of the research area Energy Transitions and Societal Change here, who will co-host the meeting. And first, maybe a few words on the focal topic here, and then we will start with introducing our guests and the lecture. So we started this focal topic year in January with the aim of bringing together different dimensions and perspectives of justice research in sustainability. And also, when we, for example, see the lecture today, we can identify many different dimensions of justice and sustainability that are very relevant. Also, when we look, for example, at transition processes like the energy transition, and now we look at a very new policy field, hydrogen policy, and we see that also in those new appearing policy fields, questions and concerns of justice become very relevant. And starting from the very roots of environmental justice, the major concern was always on marginalized and people who kind of are more affected by environmental hazards, for example. And we at the ISS also want to shed light on how transformations towards sustainability kind of impact social inequalities, but also are, for example, created under context of historical injustices, for example. And I think the example of hydrogen justice is also very interesting here in this context, and that's why we are happy to have this public lecture here today. And as I said, this is our 6th public lecture, so we had already very interesting lectures before that you can see on our website as well. Besides the public lecture series, we have different other event formats and dialogue spaces and publications planned that you can all see on our website. And we also have a newsletter that you can subscribe to. So there's a lot to discover there as well. And with this, I hand over to Rainer, who will introduce our guests.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. It's great to have you. I think it's great to also talk about hydrogen and justice. I mean, here at the ISS, we have been working for quite some time on sort of international or global energy transition and the partnerships and the exchange, the international exchange that this requires and what its implications are. But now with hydrogen, and this justice issue has, I think, taken on a whole new dimension, because when we're talking about renewables, we're mainly talking about renewables for domestic electricity generation, for domestic use. And now, of course, the hydrogen topic is very much framed as an international market that the European Union and other players are trying to create and shape. And this brings in completely new questions of justice. So I'm very happy to have our guests here to talk about this and sort of explore that topic for us and provide insights. So our speakers are Franziska Müller and Johanna Tunn. Franziska Müller is a professor at the University of Hamburg. She holds the chair of globalization and global climate governance. And there she's currently involved in 2 major research projects. One is entitled Global Power, Funds, Tools, and Networks for an African Energy Transition. And another one, and I assume this is connected to the work she's going to be presenting, is entitled H2 Politics. And I think both of these 2 projects are sort of situated in one of the research areas that Franziska has been known for, which is sort of the role of African countries in the context of a global energy transition. Johanna Tunn is a PhD student also at the University of Hamburg in the Department of Global Climate Governance, and she studied international development and innovation at Sussex and in Vienna. And she is also involved in the H2 Politics project. So with that, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, Okay, thank you. Yeah, hello also from my side, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's just great to be at ESSS again. And I remember I was here about 2 years ago, right when the pandemic started, which was also right at the date when my professorship started. So we're all both very happy to be here and present a political science perspective on green hydrogen, hydrogen risks, and hydrogen justice. And we haven't started yet. Could you share the screen for us, please?
Sure.
Yeah, lovely, thank you. Yeah. So yeah, we are gonna present a political science perspective on green hydrogen, hydrogen risks, and hydrogen justice, and we will illustrate this with a few examples from our recent research, which has only started in January, so it's all very new and sometimes still in the formative phase. Our talk is based on 2 articles we have written in our research group, H2Politics, and we are happy to circulate them later to anyone who's interested. As a quick recapture, and also as maybe not everyone here in the room and out on Zoom is equally familiar with the hydrogen debates, I'll come up with a few facts and figures of the hydrogen challenge. Yeah, decarbonisation has for most of the time been a quite loaded term, and you might still remember that in the days of the Paris Climate Conference in 2015, leaders like Angela Merkel or Barack Obama were quite cautious whether to use the term or not, because it was very clear that with this term, very radical things are associated, targeting the whole production chain, calling for systemic and groundbreaking reorganization of a nation's economy according to the do's and don'ts of carbon reduction. This has changed quite a lot in the last 7 years, and now the term decarbonisation has become much more mainstream. It slips from our lips much easier, and because we somehow now believe that decarbonisation is, of course, necessary, it is a must, and then there's also a strong belief in technology and innovation, which will in fact allow that this whole transformative project called decarbonisation will actually work. And here the hope for clean hydrogen plays, of course, a very important role, and this is also why we are witnessing this kind of hydrogen boom at the moment. This has several reasons, and one I've already said: systemic decarbonisation has become such a major push factor, but still it provides several challenges. Decarbonizing heavy industries and steel, which are one of the most important industrial sectors to tackle by green hydrogen production, is requiring a very large scale production. And recently there was the example of the ThyssenKrupp steelworks in North Rhine-Westphalia was debated. This is one of the greatest steelworks in Germany, and it's alone, and steel production is contributing to Germany's carbon emissions by 7% each year. So it makes pretty much sense to tackle steel production in the first place. However, ThyssenKrupp wants to be carbon neutral by 2045, but doing so would require about 3,000 wind turbines, and that's all wind turbines that North Rhine-Palatinate is having. And this, of course, tells quite a lot about the space that is needed to arrive at a viable decarbonization strategy for heavy industries. And that's also why many hydrogen strategies, especially the German one, so much focus on green hydrogen production in the global south, because here the imagination is that only there you can find vast and seemingly empty terrains, which is of course a quite problematic assumption, because these terrains are normally not empty and not that vast, and of course also populated by people, animals, nature. Then there's also technological innovation, and I was remembering when I was writing this lecture that when I was still in school, it was already promoted that someday there might be some hydrogen production somewhere in the Sahara, but there it seemed really like a kind of science fiction, and this of course has changed a lot due to innovations in electrolysis, transport, and also transport technologies, and also the sinking cost of renewables play an important role in that regard. And lastly, on a more political level, the hydrogen boom also means that we find new green competition and green geopolitics visible, for instance, in different value production chains, a search for new production sites that offer hydrogen production at low costs. And then this also comes with a chance to tap these first mover benefits. And this is why Germany wants to be a green hydrogen first mover. And this is something that is becoming very clear, especially in the hydrogen strategies that so much focuses on these kind of global or transnational hydrogen partnerships. So I'm saying a few words on Germany's hydrogen strategy. As I've already said, it builds very much on the idea that green hydrogen is produced in the global south, and at the moment several hydrogen partnerships are evolving. And the nice narrative is that shipping the sunshine will bring the hydrogen finally to Germany, either as hydrogen or as due to power-to-X technologies as a kind of fuel or as a kind of gas or any other transport technology. So this means, of course, that the solutions are projected in the global south, and at the moment we see a kind of public-private governance evolving. There is Germany's National Hydrogen Council, there is the H2 Global Foundation, which will come up with a kind of financing facility and auction instruments, and there are several hydrogen partnerships currently under negotiation, and much of the money is already saved for creating these hydrogen partnerships.
Next slide, please.
Could you move to the next slide?
I think we have some.
Maybe you have a miscommunication between the presenter and.
No, I think it's just that the internet is a bit slow right now. That's
okay.
why it needs some time. I hope at least it's the case.
Okay.
But did it already switch to the next
slide?
Maybe you need to click on the presentation once. And then click next.
I know that presenters never talk to me.
No, it works.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Interesting. Yeah. So in the last years, the picture. So I'm going to say a few words about the hydrogen partnerships. And in the last 2 years, the picture was very mixed, and it was, at least to me, difficult to clarify what kind of hydrogen partnership network was evolving, because the former minister Karliczek was doing several diplomatic visits, especially to West African countries like Mali, Chad, or Niger, and promoting very much the idea of hydrogen partnerships. However, due to fragile energy systems and being landlocked, I was a bit unsure whether these countries could actually be placed at the forefront of the hydrogen boom. And now the picture is becoming more clear. We see some more significant moves regarding hydrogen partnerships, and there's countries like Namibia, Chile, or South Africa, or Morocco, who are becoming much more involved in the newly emerging hydrogen diplomacy, with delegations meeting and with a partnership agreed with Namibia in May last year, a partnership that is very much based on mutual solutions and win-win terms, with a focus also very much on green industrial policies and job creation, I found, and also very much focusing on ecological risk assessments in the areas where the solar projects are planned. This I found quite an interesting issue, especially when it comes to the social ecological risks. However, southern countries are of course also developing their own strategic interests, and South Africa, for instance, is aiming at hydrogen production for their own needs, because they want to decarbonize their automotive industry and the steelworks as well, and they are not so keen to export the hydrogen to Germany. Whereas Germany would, in fact, very much like to get green hydrogen from South Africa. So there might be some kind of interest collision that still needs to be sorted out on the diplomatic level. And also countries like Nigeria or Angola, which are facing a massive risk of stranded assets due to the dependency on fossil fuels and oil, are also at the moment trying to de-risk their energy economy by setting up their own hydrogen strategies. So this means that several common narratives still need to be designed in the first place, as the interests often do not yet match. And this will be a major diplomatic issue in the years to come, I guess. And an important thing, of course, for political science research and for the kind of hydrogen governance that we will see. So yeah, and as I've already maybe mentioned, we can see that the emerging hydrogen economy does come with several risks, both on the political economy side and also on the socio-ecological side. There is kind of a gap between the technological euphoria and the real risks for nature and society along the hydrogen production chain. There's a massive need of water, of sweet water, of course. So this may cause water stress or may come with changes to the water pricing schemes in the countries involved. Also, due to the need of large areas of land, land conflicts are a problem that needs to be tackled. And then also questions of access to energy and energy poverty are an issue. So who will benefit from the massive solar sites that are going to be built in order to produce green hydrogen? Can there be a kind of win-win solution where the populations can also access these solar technologies, or when it's framed as a kind of additional technology, will there be certain trades-off associated with hydrogen production in countries in the global south? These are things that need to be taken into account in order to be sure whether hydrogen can be produced in a sustainable and just way. And furthermore, several pending conflicts like the West Sahara conflict also pervade hydrogen cooperation, because many of the solar sites are planned not on the original Moroccan terrain, but on the West Saharan terrain. And this is of course an issue that is a major diplomatic hindrance and has in the last years already caused some trouble between Germany's and Morocco's diplomacy. So that's why overall we're wondering to what extent the hydrogen partnerships practice what they preach, or how a justice dimension should be added to them in order to make sure that hydrogen is produced in a way that is at least sustainable and just. And this is exactly what our new project, H4Politics, aims at. It's working again. Yeah, so that's our research questions. We're wondering which risks are associated with green hydrogen production in the global south. We're wondering whether a sustainable hydrogen production could be ensured in line with hydrogen justice, and also what the preconditions should be for countries entering hydrogen partnerships. What should be common terms of the agreements that countries are negotiating. We are involved in several research activities. What we've done since January is risk mapping with a sample of 27 countries, all countries that have been approached by Germany in the previous years. So we have created an indicator system with indicators on energy, water, and land use conflicts, and also on socioeconomic issues like labor laws and labor conditions, and also political aspects, because we argue that any kind of hydrogen politics need to be closely connected to the energy policies of a country in order to be sure that they match with each other, and that the hydrogen economies aren't becoming some kind of green enclaves. So this is, on a political or democratic stance, a very important issue. What we then later going to do is a life cycle analysis, where we get help from engineers by Fraunhofer, because this is something that we as political scientists alone cannot do. We will do case studies in Morocco, South Africa, and Chile, and there we want to do some Delphi talks where stakeholder networks can reflect on their perceptions of hydrogen technologies in order to be sure how these emerging hydrogen economy is in fact perceived in the countries. We are at the moment already writing some publications, and Johanna Tunn and Tobias Kalt have come up with the first issue, with an article setting up a research agenda in a dialogue with Frederic Hanusch, who also came up with an article on social science and hydrogen. And this is going to be issued in Gaia next Sunday, right?
This Sunday, yeah.
Great. Yeah. So we also have an article on hydrogen justice, which is currently under review. And then as a team, we are at the moment writing a paper on the mapping exercise that we have done since January. Yeah, and for now I'm going to focus on hydrogen justice. Because this is a new concept that we are currently proposing and using as a kind of analytical tool in order to assess the different hydrogen partnerships and the hydrogen policy constellations that are currently emerging. And our concept is based on several different debates within the large field of environmental justice. There's on the one hand environmental justice, stemming from a Black radical tradition, like the works of Robert E. Ballard, who focused on environmental racism and environmental justice already in the 1980s, and looking at the uneven distribution of environmental costs and benefits along the lines of race, class, gender. So then we, of course, also zoom in on energy justice, which has been following up on the environmental justice debate and is especially interested in procedural energy justice, looking at the democratic dimensions, in distributive justice, asking who has access to energy, and then also the recognitional dimension, asking whether the vulnerabilities are all taken into account. Also, water justice plays an important role, and in the water justice debate, human rights issues are mentioned in a much stronger way, because water justice has in the ideational history so much being connected to humanitarian issues, because the right to water is also recognized as a fundamental human right by the United Nations. Yeah, and in our concept, we bring all these different dimensions together, arriving at a 6-dimensional framework, which I'm only going to point out very briefly, because Johanna will focus on the different examples that we have been carving out. So we bring several dimensions from the energy justice debate, from environmental justice, and also from water justice together, because we argue that when you want to talk about hydrogen and the positive or negative effects this may have in a justice dimension, it's important to look at both the energy side, the water side, also at land use, and also on a more meta level on epistemological issues. So that's why we, on the procedural dimension, we're asking which stakeholder constellations are currently emerging, how inclusive are they, who has a say in the ongoing debates on hydrogen, how participatory are these debates, how much are they shaped by some kind of public-private constellations, and what does this mean in democratic terms? Then on distributive level, we are wondering how the costs and benefits are distributed along the value chain, and whether we can see some new forms of resource competition, like over land or over water, evolving. Then on the restorative dimension is more looking at the long historical lines, and is wondering whether already existing injustices could be deepened by new ecological interventions, like are there already existing colonial conflicts like in the West Sahara? Are there already existing land conflicts? And what will hydrogen technology as a kind of large-scale technology change about this? How could this deepen injustice, or made also in different constellation contribute to more justice? That's also possible. Yeah, relational justice is a bit sounding like science technology studies. It's a bit of an STS thing, because it's very much asking what the relationality is. How is a technology becoming socially embedded? How does it affect human nature or human water relations? How is it embedded and socially owned in a certain constellation? And we think, because there is also an important debate on energy cultures, more in the humanities, that's why we think it's also important to have a say about this dimension, because any kind of technology also needs to be socio-culturally owned in order to be actually embedded within society. Then there's recognitional justice, which again asks for the vulnerabilities of certain groups and whether they are taken into account in hydrogen strategies. And lastly, on a more meta level, we have the epistemic justice dimension, which is interested in the kind of knowledge and in the knowledge transfers. Whose knowledge counts? How is knowledge transferred to the global south? What kind of knowledge economies are currently emerging? Like, who owns the knowledge over technologies, and to what extent is a technology transfer actually taking place, or are southern countries only considered as a kind of resource giver, like it has been so often the case with many other different resources? So that's for the concept all together in a nutshell. And for now, I'm handing over to Johanna for the different examples that we have already carved out from our research.
Thanks a lot, Franziska. Also, thanks from my side for having me, for inviting me. As Franziska's already mentioned, we have mapped so far 27 countries in Western and Southern Africa, and for example, also Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, to see what kind of socio-ecological, political, and economic risks could emerge in the hydrogen economy. And with this concept of hydrogen justice, we kind of merged these risks and saw which kind of justices or actually injustices may be at stake. And I'm going to present some cases that we found, quite devastating in this context. Thank you. So as Franziska has mentioned, one dimension is the dimension of procedural justice, which is often used in a kind of legal context, but can also be applied to non-legal contexts in which a process is employed to allocate resources, divide benefits and burdens, but also to resolve disputes. And especially in the face of hydrogen governance, we see a lot of, or a couple of procedural injustices that may already be at stake. One dimension could be the global hydrogen market and global hydrogen governance, where already, as Franziska has already mentioned, a lot of number of hydrogen dedicated institutions, projects, and initiatives are already emerging. And there's a lot of governance going on in the bilateral energy partnerships, building pilot projects in countries of the global south. There are new funding instruments like H2 Global Foundation at the bottom of the page, and a lot of established institutions like ARENA, International Energy Agency, or the German Corporation for International Development, that support already hydrogen strategies in countries of the global south, for example, in Namibia. So there's a lot of governance going on, and the important question is to ask which multi-stakeholder governance constellations are actually evolving and how inclusive are they? And what does it mean for hydrogen diplomacy? And are these very beneficial or mutually beneficial hydrogen futures, or rather unequal hydrogen governance processes? What we've seen through our mapping activities is that there are several countries such as Kenya, Ghana, and Namibia who have adopted comprehensive RE policy frameworks, but there are only few cases where actually participatory energy policy frameworks. So participation of the local population is not really at stake. Furthermore, there are only some countries that have their own hydrogen strategies, such as Chile, Morocco, or South Africa. This may also mean that hydrogen transitions lack political transparency and are loosely, if at all, connected to domestic energy policies. So there's kind of a, they emerge separate from other policies, and they may not be integrative. Also, when governance structures are rather centralized and exclude critical voices from civil society, public participation opportunities and contestations may be hindered. This is, for example, the case in Tunisia, whose energy transition thus far has been a very centralized process, that by mainly a few central state entities providing little space, if any, for local contestations or local authorities to contest basically these energy policies and also contest large-scale renewable energy projects. Another dimension might be the allocation of resources and participation in the realm of procedural justice or procedural injustice, and equality and access in international hydrogen partnerships. There are a lot of, for example, the H2 Global Foundation is a German foundation that was built for the uptaking of the global hydrogen market and to bring together demand and supply of hydrogen from the global south and Europe or Germany. However, in order to participate in this market or in this auction mechanism, the German Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action specified that companies must provide evidence of many years of market knowledge and presence in the EU, as you see from this quote on there, which also indicates that this condition may not be met by local, decentralized, and possibly more democratized stakeholders in the global south. But enough about procedural justice. I think there's a lot of more going on, but there's some cases we found very interesting. Another dimension that Franziska has also mentioned, distributive justice or distributive injustice, I'd say. One case that is very prevalent here is the project in Congo, which is likely to materialize in the future. In distributive justice, like in general, we argue that specifically or especially export-oriented hydrogen production creates global justice challenges. While importing countries such as Germany or in general Europe benefit from hydrogen imports, hydrogen production may create distributive injustice in the producing countries when there's low energy and water access rates, unjust energy and water pricing structures, water dependency, and dangers of drought. Energy poverty may actually grow if existing energy generation capacities are redirected to hydrogen production. Similarly, water stress and dangers of drought may increase additional players with high freshwater needs, such as in the hydrogen economy, enter the economy. There are a couple of principles which aim at going against this, for example, the principle of additionality, but it's still a huge question whether sustainability criteria will actually include such additional criteria of providing extra energy for the local population. For example, in Congo, there exist some plans to produce green hydrogen using hydropower from environmentally controversial megadams, such as the Inga 3 dam. What we see here is the Inga 2 dam, because Inga 3 doesn't exist yet, but there are a couple of plans and financial flows that are likely to materialize in the future. Apart from considerable social and environmental damage and the displacement of approximately 37,000 agricultural households, Inga 3 would actually aggravate energy poverty. The population in Congo Central Province and other areas of the country receive hardly any of the electricity produced due to there being no electricity grid to make it accessible. So there have been quite some activist voices and some studies who've shown this. Furthermore, as the Congolese government has announced, electricity produced will primarily supply the national extractive industry and will be exported to other countries. So we have a country with the lowest electrification rates worldwide and energy access rates. And obviously there will be some justice conflicts evolving when this project actually materializes. Another dimension, restorative justice, as Franziska has already said, the German government is very active in Namibia. There's a huge funding project, a research project with $40 million, which aims at developing or co-developing Namibian hydrogen strategy. But there's also this new project in the Tsaukaip National Park, which is gonna materialize, I think, in the next couple of years. In general, you can argue that existing injustices may be deepened by hydrogen projects, especially in contexts where there's a lot of colonial history, especially interesting here, obviously German history, where there's low union density, labor rights violations, or high gender inequality rates, actually. And then also existing land conflicts, for example, and violence against environmental justice activists that indicate restorative injustices and may deepen due to additional competition over scarce land or parkland deals or exclusion from resource use. This example in Namibia is an explicitly export-oriented project, actually, covering 1/5 of Namibia Tsaukaip National Park. There's a consortium of Hyphen Hydrogen Energy, which is a joint venture between Enertrag and Nicholas Holdings, a very dubious investment company, actually. And they have signed an agreement with Windhoek to invest $9.4 billion, which is equivalent to Namibia's GDP, and also as much as the whole German hydrogen strategy, which is 9 billion euros. So it's a huge amount of money. Hyphen plans to build facilities in the park on the coast of the southwest of the country. So there's the Orange River, and plans to produce 300,000 tons of green hydrogen by converting 5,000 megawatt of electricity from wind and solar farms. And to just have like a picture of how big this area is, it's 1.5 times the size of the German Saarland. So it's a huge area, actually. So while the production of hydrogen would allow Namibia to decrease its energy dependence, especially from South Africa, and to become an energy exporter instead of an importer, especially to Europe and to South Africa. So geopolitically, this might be very interesting, obviously, for Namibia. The focus on green hydrogen as an emerging market opportunity for export is following rather financialized project logics, and not really the needs, especially of the people, of the population, especially marginalized populations. This poses several risks in terms of procedural justice related to local energy access, energy poverty, water scarcity, and obviously land acquisitions, but also histories of large-scale land acquisitions without consultation of local populations, and especially in Namibia, also gaps between good legislation and inadequate implementation of land reforms, and especially enforcements that tend to overlook Namibia's most marginalized people in these programs that pose general high risks. relational injustice, yeah, mostly produced through cooperative behavior, but also dialogue amongst actors in conflict or post-conflict situations. But as Franziska has also said, especially how are technologies implemented in society, how they're socially and culturally owned, actually. We can also focus on human nature relationships and how these might be disturbed through the implementation of new technologies or mega projects, as for example, the huge project, mega city green hydrogen project in Saudi Arabia. Why this speaks to relational justice is, for example, the displacement and violence towards people to construct this new mega project in Saudi Arabia. It's a planned city which is supposed to be 107 kilometers of length, and it's a plan to put within the city. It is a plan for Saudi Arabia to become the biggest supplier of green hydrogen, actually. Why it's 4 million tons of carbon-free hydrogen should be produced by 2030, and the whole investment is $5 billion, actually. The project attracts a lot of investors with advertisements and dreamy pictures. Actually, there's this narrative such as, I present to you the line, a city of 1 million residents with a length of 170 kilometers that preserves 95% of nature with a neon, with 0 cars, 0 streets, and 0 carbon emissions. So it's very solar punk, it's very sci-fi.
Very zero.
Yeah, very zero. Yeah, and but yeah, then obviously when you look into it and you read some newspaper articles, you see that the reality actually looks different. Human rights campaigners say that 2 towns have already been cleared and 20,000 members of the Huawei TED people forcibly removed without adequate compensation in order to build the mega city, actually, or parts. So there are some parts that have already been built. While Huawei TED activists struggle against the land grab that threatens their livelihoods and culture of the now semi-settled Huawei TED population in Saudi Arabia, the project continues with the oppressive practices, such as the killing of Abdurrahim al-Waidi. There's a Twitter tweet of which says that the killing happened. In 2020, one of the residents who actually refused to leave his property. Yeah, and such stories obviously show that the dream of a few people to build these kind of solar punk and sci-fi towns and cities, and also these very sustainable narratives also don't threaten cultural, ecological, and economic livelihoods of local residents and may threaten those in the future. Recognition injustice, Franziska has already outlined recognition justice, but also the dispute in Western Sahara, which is obviously it's a very contemporary topic because even the Bundestag, there's a lot of discussion going on in some fractions. And yeah, in case of hydrogen, generally marginalized and discriminated population groups may be particularly affected by water or energy poverty. And the dimension of recognitional justice holds that their perspectives should obviously be integrated into hydrogen policies, labor laws, contracts, and so on. But we see that a lot of projects actually follow rather financialized project logics, but also what we see, especially with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, also very security policy driven decisions as to where build collaborations with which countries or regimes. Recognition justice is obviously at stake concerning democracy and renewable energy policy and hydrogen strategy, as well as evolving hydrogen diplomacies that threaten the recognition of Western Saharis. Below, for example, you see an excerpt from the hydrogen roadmap of Morocco, and in the red circles, you can see that Morocco actually incorporated Western Sahara into its hydrogen strategy, but also in the renewable energy policies as an undisputed territory. So it says as part of it, and renewable energy will be drawn from Western Sahara. As a recent study from last year by Ellen has shown, is that the Moroccan renewable energy leadership, because Morocco is kind of portrayed as a leader in renewable energy, actually relies on renewable energy drawn from or sourced from occupied Western Sahara, whilst, as we probably all know, Sahrawis are consistently facing human rights violations and denied access to energy and water. This may also be the case for hydrogen facilities or renewable energy that is generated from Western Sahara. For example, the French company Total has a project in southern Morocco which is going to materialize very soon. Actually, I think it is this year or next year, and it's likely to cover also parts of Western Sahara. So yeah, the dependency on disputed territories for green hydrogen supply and collaboration with authoritative regimes may not only perpetuate these injustices, but further weaken Sahrawi's claims for recognition and self-determination. I've also included the response from the German government actually to the case of Western Sahara, which was very, they kind of shifted their positions in terms of hydrogen diplomacy. Before they were very kind of more pro-Polisario, and now they have shifted their positioning and kind of flattened it in terms of hydrogen diplomacy, because they obviously have a need and there's a race to the bottom for hydrogen, and it moves to the background, let's say. Exactly. Last but not least, epistemic justice or epistemic injustice. There are a lot of interesting things going on. As Franziska's already said, this is more of a meta, maybe injustice or justice dimension, but I think there are also very kind of concrete things we can see in the hydrogen economy right now, where we see how knowledge transfers take place in the hydrogen economy, whose knowledge over land use or energy need actually counts, and how dominant hydrogen knowledges may also legitimize other forms of violence, actually. Maybe to the context. Okay. Social science research has vastly shown that energy knowledge is predominantly created by epistemic communities in the global north. And this leads obviously to unequal distribution of energy knowledges that privileges technocratic epistemologies and marginalizes often alternative knowledge systems, and also prevails or perpetuates a colonial knowledge system in general. This prevents technological ownership and can lead to energy cultures that reflect, for example, racial inequalities. And hydrogen policies and strategies can recreate such inequities if they do not guarantee fair knowledge and technology transfer, or do not sufficiently consider local knowledge systems. On the left, for example, we see an excerpt from the recent Repower EU initiative, which implies, for example, that technologies, expertise, and hydrogen knowledge generation ought to remain primarily in the global north, while hydrogen resources should be brought from the global south to the north in order to drive European decarbonisation. These strategies, in our view, suggest unfair resource exchanges in which valuable resources and materials are unequally shared and exchanged, basically. And such strategies are often anchored in more Western narratives of progress, and falsely suggest that good development needs Europe's help, and that African energy transitions should follow European models. Another example, and this is the last one, maybe projects in which hydrogen potentials are evaluated only from a techno-economic perspective. You see, this is an expert from the website of the Potential Atlas, which is a BMBF-initiated research collaboration between Forschungszentrum Jülich, SASCA, and WASCA, South African and West African research centers. And these often classify land into, or according to, technical and objective categories of hydrogen potentials. And for example, critical geographers have shown that such simplified mappings obfuscate and often depoliticize underlying structural dimensions of inequality, and that they do not consider local socioeconomic and environmental conditions, wants and needs of the population, and also non-Western human nature relationships. On the other side, such images most of the time show very vast, desolated areas, and these are often used in those hydrogen strategies and based on selection of hydrogen sites. But such images represent Africa as a landscape that is available, a resource that can be extracted, and they also imply that such empty sun-drenched steppes actually are steppes that you can just use, and often built on colonial fictions of, for example, terra nullius that are very inaccurate and have historically been used or instrumentalized for colonial invasion. So how these kind of pictures or images and narratives go together with displacements, for example, is still a case that needs to be evaluated. But I think these cases already show that there are a lot of injustice going on, and also that these injustices are obviously overlapping. There's not just one injustice in one case, but we see several injustices overlapping, and if one justice dimension is violated, then it's very highly likely that other injustices are already at stake. To offer some possible pathways, I think Franziska wanted
Maybe to sum it all up. So we propose this framework as a kind of analytical scheme for assessing how hydrogen relations, hydrogen partnerships, hydrogen projects could be assessed, and to what extent they may deepen injustices, but also as a kind of framework that could be used in order to come up with better solutions and with hydrogen partnerships that take into account the different risks that may be associated with this new and sometimes very sci-fi technology. We think it would be essential to carry out these hydrogen risks assessments and integrate hydrogen justice already in the project planning and in the different partnerships as a kind of point. There could also be something like a certificate on fair green hydrogen, as we have it with a palm oil in a quite greenwash way, but as we also have it with clothes or with chocolate or with any other product coming from the global south, and their certified hydrogen may of course be the next case, which would of course also require strong monitoring and also outreach for instance involving the ITOC or the ILO into these kind of negotiations, so that they could also have their say, and also environmental activists. I mean, of course, an alternative could be to concentrate on less remote hydrogen projects that could be aligned with specific industrial needs. And there, for instance, the city of Bremen is also coming up with a kind of climate neutrality strategy by 2030, and they plan to decarbonize their steelwork by offshore wind platforms all along the Bremen coastline in the North Sea. So in some areas, this could, of course, be an alternative. And overall, we think it's of course important to be aware of green hydrogen's role for decarbonization and just transition. It's a very delicate technology with lots of hopes, but also coming with a lot of challenges. And we think they need to be addressed in a holistic way. So much. Thanks for listening on this very, very hot afternoon. And we're happy to discuss with you. Thanks for listening.
Okay, thank you, Johanna. Thank you, Franziska. We're going to try to take questions from both from the participants online and from inside this room, but I will just kick it off with one question, because lots of your, or the important part of this presentation was conceptual, and you talked about different concepts of justice, and you're going to be applying them in your research project. A term that only came up at the very end, in sort of at the bottom of one of the slides, I think, was the concept of just transition. Mm-hmm. So can you say something about why you chose the framing that you chose, and you didn't choose the just transition framing, or maybe you are and you just didn't present it? Maybe you can just speak to that for a moment.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I mean, these terms cannot be used completely interchangeably, but they are very closely related to each other. The justice framework, of course, refers much more to the long-standing debates on energy justice, environmental justice, and so on. Whereas the just transition narrative is much more focusing on how any kind of energy transition can be socially and ecologically just. So how nature's interests, but also labor laws, could be brought together in a mutually agreeable way. I think in that way we could of course bring both concepts together. We could easily speak of a just hydrogen transition, which would wonder how is this transition taking place on a landscape, regime, or niche level, and how just are the projects that are evolving, like on a governance level, on a regime level, or on a niche level with the individual projects. This would be a way of bringing both concepts closer together, I'd say.
Okay. Thank you. Is there maybe somebody in the room that wants to ask a question? So how are we going to do this? Are we doing this with microphones?
Yes,
Okay.
you have to put them on.
So I will give the first question to Enrique, and then Jana, and we can start passing.
I think I have a follow-up question on this. I really liked your like rich catalog of different justice dimensions that you applied to your empirical research. And I was wondering, because we also, of course, work with those dimensions, think a lot about how to reflect them and so on. And I would be interested also in your experience and, for example, operationalizing those terms and how to also clearly divide them, because I stumbled a bit about the restorative justice term, for example, because then I thought, how do I, like in your understanding, empirically divide this from distributive justice, for example, and also I like very much your double connotation, so to say, from injustice and justice. And then I thought, for example, for the restorative justice term, is this working for restorative justice? Because this is usually a term that is used as justice and not as injustice, because it's from post-conflict societies and it's about restoring relationships and so on. Is there something like a process of like unrestoring relations, or would distributive justice, for example, be a better fit there? So I thought about, and because this is not to be nitty-gritty about your research design, just to hear your reflections on your experiences on this, because we are also struggling, of course, with those terms, and I think it's a great contribution to have all those, like really all those terms and this rich panorama of different justice dimensions in there. But I think also, of course, there are pitfalls coming along the way, and I would be interested in your experience so far.
Absolutely. Yeah. Should we take several questions or only one?
I feel like that was a big one to chew on.
Yeah, it's a big one. No, thanks a lot for the remarks. It's very interesting. I'm definitely not an expert on restorative justice. But yeah, I think that, as we said in the presentation, like the different justice dimensions are very overlapping. So it's really hard to just detect one justice or injustice dimension, which is also very hard for the case selection. And in terms of restorative injustice, that's definitely something to think about. I think if restorative justice may, for example, Namibia has this Harambe National Justice Plan, which is kind of a strategy which involves climate and energy policies, which ought to be more just for the population. So if these plans, including the hydrogen strategy, which ought to be implemented in this plan, actually entail restorative justice components, then maybe one could look at whether they are given justice, those components. So this could be kind of an historical injustice, but then I'm really not an expert, it's just something to think about. In this case, I really just, because we were speaking about hydrogen justice in the presentation, but I was more showing the hydrogen injustice dimension, so I chose the slash, and it wasn't really much of a deeper consideration of what this might mean. So yeah.
May I add on that maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, we have been debating in our team on how to operationalize further these 6 dimensions and connect them to the different indicators that we have been creating in our matrix. And in matrix, we have a quite long indicator system with several energy indicators, several water and several land use indicators, and also several socioeconomic indicators. There's things like union density or water stress or marine biodiversity, because desalination systems may be an issue. And what we are doing at the moment is to connect these different indicators to the different justice dimensions. And speaking of restorative justice, we could, for instance, use our labor law indicators and our land conflict indicators or land grabbing indicators in order to have a kind of impression to what extent restorative injustice are already existing and to what extent they could then be deepened. Speaking of distributive hydrogen justice, indicators that deal with access to energy, access to water, access to land could be connected to that dimension. And speaking of epistemic justice, would more focus on the discursive dimension. There, one in fact there's not an easy indicator, but therefore one needs to look at the patent applications or at the different partnership contracts in order to be sure what happens to the knowledge and the knowledge transfer. and with recognitional justice and vulnerabilities. For instance, the level of energy poverty could be one of the indicators. So that's that's a way of bringing this all together, but that's of course a kind of a complex issue. But this will allow us to arrive at a kind of matrix where the hypotheses and the indicators and the justice dimensions are connected.
So my question, I'm wondering whether like all these instances of injustice that you found, whether they're related to the fact that basically all the hydrogen projects we have now, they're like really utility scale, very large scale projects. I mean, that's the difference, not the renewables. Like renewables were decentralized from the very beginning. And I think maybe there is a potential for hydrogen to be decentralized in the future with like much better chances for local development. But the way it is now, we need to bring the costs down, we need to have large scale. Is it just like, to me, it comes somehow together. So I wonder whether that might be overcome in the future if we find like feasible technological paths for hydrogen to be produced in a decentralized way, and or that it would make sense actually. Because to me, that's a big difference.
Yeah, that's definitely a big difference. I do hope so in the future, definitely. I think I heard in another talk that the decentralization is actually not that hard. So the technology is not that hard to apply, especially in decentralized context. The question is, what would you use hydrogen for? If you could electricization is probably the better choice, especially in the decentralized areas or projects. So I think that remains the question, what do you use hydrogen for? And yeah, how does it make sense in local economies also? Yeah.
It's by nature has to be.
Yeah.
Yes.
There are several questions in the chat. So
Okay, so
Can you show them?
I will do that.
thank you so much for the amazing presentation, and I learned a lot. I think it's the first time I really look at the topic, and my field of research is mostly Latin America and the Amazon, and for me it's impossible to not compare with the history of hydroelectric power in the Amazon. So my question to you, the first question maybe it's do you think that the history or the experience of hydroelectric power and these other conflicts can help you to think about your research and the elements that you are bringing to your research? In that case, we learned so far that justice and bringing justice for a justice arena already is something that brings disadvantage to specific minorities or groups that always needs to deal with litigations, or the example, for example, of Ecuador, or even in Brazil right now, we see that it's sometimes the language of justice, it's something that brings another layer that complicates how then to dig more about the topic. And the other thing, because also like I'm from Brazil, but even looking at the Amazon, because I'm from São Paulo, I feel like a gringo digging with the problem, and I bring to you this question about the epistemic justice, because I know that as a researcher, maybe it was the hint to be in Germany that brought you to the topic, but then how you are connecting your topic with academics, or how is the discussion about your topic in these countries that you are looking at as case studies, but then how to bring this epistemic justice to your own research as a practice.
Yeah, thanks also from my side for this great presentation. I really like the conceptual work and the critical perspective that you put. I actually had two questions, but I think I will only stick with the first one so that we still have chances also for the questions in the chat. You brought up this principle of additionality, and from a first point of view, it sounds very logical that you say, well, like these kind of hydrogen projects have to be additional in order to be just. But then when I thought about the details, I thought it's maybe not that simple. For instance, if you look at a country that has levels of energy poverty, would you say that, well, as long as these capacities are additional, then this means it's a just hydrogen project? Or does it basically mean that, well, first of all, you have to basically eradicate these levels of energy poverty in order to basically then be in the situation to export energy. So I wondered how to really deal with this principle and how to measure it or operationalize it. I think it's maybe not that simple. So I wondered if you have any ideas about that already, or whether this is operationalized in a sense already in the empirical examples that you see.
So we take these two and then we go to the chat.
Sure. I can start with the last question. There are some initiatives who aim at implementing additionality. There has been a recent study by Arepo and the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung who evaluated additionality 2.0, so it's more advanced concept of additionality. So basically additionality means that projects are only in this case, additionality would mean that the local population is provided with electricity and extra water so that no energy is basically taken from them. I think the big problem currently is that of why additionality is so important is that there are no fossil lock-ins in those countries happening, because like all the renewable electricity is built, but all the energy is taken for hydrogen. Hence, there's more fossil energy used in those countries, which may also lead to fossil lock-ins, but also disadvantages in local value chains or competition. So I think there need to be very strong sustainability criteria, and there are some initiatives, I think, on the European level who should, for example, have climate change, criteria, sustainability criteria between climate issues and also the investors that are going into the project. So this need to be, very, I don't know, strict. I think I can't say more. It's a very, Franziska, do you want to say more about this?
No, actually not. Please.
Okay. So it's really important to have very hard criteria, but how they should look like specifically is really hard to say, I guess. I mean, the main point is that they should be fair and that the local population should actually take advantages out of the hydrogen economy, also in terms of energy access, water access, and so forth.
That was your question. I found a very excellent, but also very difficult to resolve question, because it tackles the whole, epistemic and historical level. And I think it's very important to look at the situation in Brazil, because there's very much to learn, especially regarding the unfolding of technologies, the knowledge that is already in the system, and also the kind of violence that has happened regarding dam projects, for instance. And here I think it's very important to acknowledge hydrogen as a kind of socio-technic, socio-cultural system that builds on previous experiences with large-scale projects and with technological knowledge. I would also very, very strongly say that the experiences that have been made by environmental activists striving for more justice can be very important in that regard. And I think there's very much to learn from the Brazilian case. And in our project, there's Nina Glatzer, who is German-Brazilian, and she is much more the expert on that as I personally am, because she's very much involved with these issues. So she would definitely be the person to talk to in case you want to explore that issue much more. And regarding epistemologies, how we're gonna how that's going to materialize within our project. I mean, when we do this kind of Delphi discussions, the beauty of Delphi talks is that people reflect on an issue, you collect all different perceptions of technology, and then you do one or two later interviews with them and confront them with their perceptions, visions, imaginaries, and find out to what extent this changes, to what extent their own knowledge is somehow contested, and that gives good insights in both the perception of the technology, but also on a more epistemological level, what kind of energy knowledge is already there, how this knowledge is changing or evolving as so. And so this is why by using these Delphi dialogue method, we not only hope to gather some kind of expert knowledge, as people always do when they do these kind of expert interviews in social science, that social science are unfortunately so prone of, but it's a more advanced methodology, because it's much more trying to go into the details and much more looking at the ways in which knowledge is produced, and also at the kind of contradictions that pervade any form of knowledge production. I hope that this answers at least part of the question, because it's a question that one could do a whole research project about it.
No, yeah. Okay, thank you very much. So there are several, we have 35 participants in the online meeting so far. There have been 40 in between. And there's one question from the chat that I was asked to read out, and also 4 people are raising their hands. I have already taken like 2 people in the pipeline because we also have to watch the time. So the first question that I should read out is by Carla Schulte-Fischedijk, and she asked 2 questions. What are the concrete plans to bring the policy recommendations to the decision makers? And do you also consider the potential threat to marine ecosystems and thus fish stocks from the desalination plants, and where can one find any findings on this? Yeah, if you want to take another question, I can ask Dr. Backe or her account.
Yeah. There's 3 of us here, but we actually have 2 questions. So then you'll have 4, but go ahead.
Hi, my name is Darren Barney from McGill University. Thank you for your presentation. My question is whether you can tell us a little bit more about transportation and storage of hydrogen products, and any either specific risks or specific justice concerns that attach particularly to questions of transportation and storage, whether in a local and regional context or across some of the transnational markets. Thanks.
And my question is, what I understood from the talk, and this might be wrong, is that Germany is the customer and Namibia or Congo is, just as examples, are the sellers. Or are you talking about a company to company market? Because it seemed like you're talking about a nation to nation relationship. And if it is a nation to nation relationship, why in the world would this replicate capitalist modes of exploitation and profiteering? Right, because there's no reason not to. Actually looked up the definition of justice because I wasn't sure what it meant really, and it's a quality of being fair and reasonable. So I don't understand why a nation to nation relationship would not actually push for a quality of being fair and reasonable. So I'm just interested what you've found in this regard.
Okay.
Do you want to start with the last one?
Yeah, maybe I start with the last one and then hand over to Johanna. Yeah, basically, I mean, what's happening in these hydrogen partnerships is that, of course, you have a nation to nation cooperation or a kind of communique of understanding in the first place. And then for the Namibian case, I can say that then a kind of political council is established and a kind of technological council is established who both sort out the particularities, both of the political cooperation and also of the economic cooperation. Yeah, and regarding questions of green capitalism and nation-to-nation cooperation, I mean, here's of course the political scientist speaking. It's not that easy as it seems, because I mean, nation-to-nation cooperation, of course, doesn't imply that this is a kind of yeah, equal cooperation on a similar level, because the relationship would be based on strong dependencies and on also strong notions of inequalities between, for instance, let's say Germany and Congo, or Germany and Namibia. And in the Namibian case, the Namibian government has a share of about 24% in the large project that is currently evolving. And on the one hand, one could of course say, yes, this is very powerful. This is a kind of arm wrestling if necessary. But on the other hand, this also means that the Namibian government shoulders a really high risk that amounts to a quarter of their gross domestic product a year. And this is again something that deepens dependency very much. Also, one should not only think of nation-to-nation corporations, but place this in the larger scale of many different corporations that are evolving, and there could be, of course, competition between the different partnerships and a kind of race to the bottom, where different countries in the global south as the sellers are competing as who sells the cheapest hydrogen, who has the lowest ecological and social standards. And this, of course, would be very problematic. And I mean, this is something that we have seen with many other commodities coming from southern countries, like with textiles or with cocoa production. So, and that's why it's nation-to-nation cooperation isn't as innocent as it may sound.
Yeah, I'm going to refer to the question about transport and storage. There basically, so maybe more general, there are 3 ways to transport hydrogen: via pipelines, ship, or trucks. There are a couple of trucks that are going around, but also obviously it's very short distance. Regarding the ships, or in general, I would say that hydrogen transportation, especially from countries of the global south, is what we could call in German Zukunftsmusik. So it's very hypothetical. It's very far in the future, and I think there are some studies that suggest before 2030 there will be no hydrogen imports from countries of the global south, but hydrogen will be allocated only from Europe, or exactly from Europe. Ships, there is no commercial ship yet that actually transports hydrogen. There's one there's one pilot project in Japan, which it's a pilot project. They're trying out different technologies, but technology is not really ready to transport hydrogen for long distances via ship. Although it would be the most cost efficient thing to transport hydrogen via ship if it's above 3,000 kilometers of transportation distance. Pipelines are yet another issue. I think there are so far 3 pipelines existing in Germany, and there's also a European project going on under the important projects of common European interest. It's another funding which also allocates a lot of money to projects. I think it was 55 projects in the case of hydrogen, and within these projects it's planned to build 1,700 kilometers of hydrogen pipelines within Germany. And there are also already existing pipelines in France, Belgium, and Netherlands. So they're kind of pilot projects, and let's see how it's going. The big problem is basically, especially from transportations from the global south, there's, for example, the Morocco and Nigeria pipeline that is planned, but it's also very politically brisant. There's the Angola project, which Germany, I think, started a couple of weeks ago, or plans to start it. The problem is, in order to transport hydrogen also through pipelines, it is good to create derivatives. So, for example, ammonia, because it's easier to transport, and I think it's also more secure. The problem is that in order to decarbonize industries in Germany, and especially in Europe, you need pure hydrogen. So if you use derivatives like ammoniac, transport it to Europe or to Germany, and then you have to transform them again, you lose a lot of energy, actually. So the transportation is quite a technically challenging issue, and it's also super it costs a lot, and it's regarding energy losses and stuff. It's also very challenging at the moment. So it's a lot of Zukunftsmusik currently. Yeah, maybe some insights into transportation. Regarding dissemination plans and ecologies, I think there was one question in our mapping. We included some data on marine ecologies. We used the ocean health map, for example, to see how corals and how fisheries may be impacted by desalination plants. I think that was the question, right?
Yeah, part of that, there was actually another question. And I was just making up my mind of the indicators that we use. There is an indicator on the level of artisanal fishing in countries with a coastline, and this could be, of course, one issue that's affected. And then the already existing stress on marine biodiversity. But we haven't seen good works on marine biodiversity threatened by desalination plants in a comparative perspective so far, if I'm right, maybe I'm wrong.
Not, and especially not in the context of artisanal fishing, like cultural livelihoods and things like that.
Yeah, and with policy recommendations and so on, I would say, well, we go with the flow, because this debate is just currently evolving, and it's very exciting how it works and what it will bring. I mean, my experience as a researcher based at a university is always that it's not that easy to run on parallel paths and to do basic research and translate it to the public all at the same time. That's always a bit tricky. We try to do that because we're very interested in that issue, but sometimes this is something where think tanks are in fact much better when I'm looking to Rainer on my left side, for instance. So that's always a tricky question, how to make the stuff also publicly and politically accessible. But in Hamburg, we're quite well connected also due to the cluster of excellence.
Okay, so we have 3 more questions, people raising their hand online and also their questions in the chat. Unfortunately, we only have 9 minutes left, so we cannot take all of them. But Johannes Vollenhorst now appears a bit below, but I think he was the next one who raised his hand. So would you like to activate your microphone and ask your question live?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you so much for the presentation. Really, really interesting. I'm currently based in Scotland and study the hydrogen transition here. This is a bit of a different story because it's very much based on transition from oil and gas towards more of a blue hydrogen, but also a bit of green hydrogen. And already there are talks also to export hydrogen from Scotland to Germany. And one of the big questions that comes up in discussions here is around hydrogen technology and who is the one who's going to provide all of the technology around there. And so I was wondering, in your assessment of risks and opportunities, how much do you see kind of the chance that there's a positive effect on any of the countries that you're looking at in terms of developing local economies? Not in terms of only providing the energy, but also creating knowledge and technology locally. For instance, in South Africa, there's some experience around fuel cells, I think. Are those things that you have been looking into and that you're thinking about? Thank you so much.
Okay, cool. Yeah, thanks a lot for the question. I think it's a very interesting question as to who owns technology. So what we're also looking at, or what is one of kind of the hypothesis, is that hydrogen strategies of the respective countries are emerging separate of the, for example, arid policies or industries. This is an indicator that, yeah, these may not be integrative to the industries. For example, what we see in Morocco, there's huge imports of ammoniac actually going on. So the local ammoniac industry is aimed at being integrated into the hydrogen strategy. Another case, maybe, for example, Egypt, where there's a lot of installation of photovoltaic plant, but actually it's companies from Norway who bring in all the technology to Egypt, and there are no local industries really included into the hydrogen strategies. So this may indicate that technologies may be, yeah, may not be owned and locally integrated into the industry, thus indicating, yeah, that technology and knowledge remains in certain parts of the global north, whereas, for example, yeah, as you said, in South Africa, the platinum industry is very much integrated into the hydrogen strategy. So it's really, you have to look at each country, see how is the hydrogen strategy formulated, who did it, who's involved in it, and which kind of industries are actually targeted and which are left out. Yeah. You want to add something? Yeah, perfect.
Okay, so that leaves us to thank you for coming here and for giving this talk and for introducing us to this topic that's going to become more and more important, I think, over time. And congratulations for, you know, having already started working on it, and also congratulations on the Gaia article, which I can highly recommend because I've already had the chance to read it. And yeah, with that, also thanks to the audience for joining us. And yeah, let's keep the discussion going.
Yeah, thanks also very much from our side. And as there were still some questions who couldn't be posted from the chat, please send us an email to, I mean, yeah, Franziska Müller at uni-hamburg. I mean, you will find us anyhow. But yeah, we're happy to stay within dialogue with you. Thanks.
Thank you.